Hello, Math 7 students. We are now starting Module 2, Lesson 10 video, and the name of this lesson is Develop Rules for Multiplying Signed Numbers, and we can find that on page 67 in my comp book. So I'm turning there to page 67, and here we are. So the title is Develop Rules for Multiplying Signed Numbers. Our goal for today we will learn the rules for multiplying signed numbers. Yesterday we played with them a little bit and we said them a lot, so hopefully you can figure out the rules by today, by the end of today. The question, what is multiplicative inverse? Okay, you've been hearing that a lot from me from the very beginning of the school year, and hopefully by today you'll have a complete understanding of it. What is multiplicative inverse? Okay, things to know. We have kind of a long list here. Things to know. Oh my goodness, it is a very long list, so we'll start back up here to help you. All right, multiplicative inverse means to multiply an amount by a negative 1. Okay, so let's pause for just a second. A couple lessons ago you heard or you learned about the additive inverse, and I told you that the additive inverse means to add the opposite. Well, when you're multiplying and you have the multiplicative inverse, it means that you take whatever number you have and you multiply it by a negative 1. And when you do that, that makes it the opposite. Okay? So multiplicative inverse means to multiply any amount by a negative 1. If a positive number is multiplied by a negative 1, the answer will be negative. If a negative number is multiplied by a negative 1, the answer is positive. So let's take a look at this. So if I have a negative 1 times 6, first of all, my question is, what was the number? The number was 6. Okay, it's positive. 6, positive 6. Well, I multiply it by a negative 1, and when I do that, I get a negative 6. Okay, well, let's look at this next one then. So it says multiplicative inverse is when you multiply any number by a negative 1. So there's my negative 1 times, but what is this number this time? This number is already negative. So what is the opposite of this number? Well, the answer is 6. So we have negative 1 times a negative 6 gives me a 6, whereas if I take negative 1 times a positive 6, I get a negative 6. So what I'm trying to show you right here is when you take a negative 1 times any amount, you're going to get the opposite. So this was a positive 6, now it's a negative 6. This was a negative 6, now it's a positive 6. Okay, and that's what multiplicative inverse means. You multiply it by a negative 1 and your answer is the opposite. Okay, all right, so multiplying by a negative 1 is the same as getting a product that is the opposite of the number. Okay, so that's kind of hard to understand, but it really isn't because it is exactly what I just said. So let's look again and see what happens. Take a negative 1 times a positive 4. What are you going to get? Everybody count. 1, 2, 3. Negative 4, because that's the opposite. Good job. Okay, we have a negative 1 times a negative 4. Look at this one. It's already negative. So what's the opposite? 4. You are correct. Okay, so whenever you take negative 1 times a number, the answer is going to be its opposite. So if I had negative 1 times 100, the answer would be, since the 100 is positive, the answer would be negative 100. That's right. If I took a negative 1 times 45, it's a positive 45. So what's the opposite of positive 45? Negative 45. Good job. I think you're getting it. All right. So negative 4 is the opposite of 4. So negative 4 is the opposite of 4. 4 is the opposite of negative 4. Okay, so hopefully this is starting to make sense. So multiplying signed numbers rules are a positive times a positive equals a positive. A negative times a positive equals a negative. See, a negative times a positive gave me a negative. Okay, last one. A negative times a negative gave me a positive. Check it out. Negative times a negative gave me a positive. So those are our rules when you're working with multiplying signed numbers. A positive times a positive gives me a top positive. A negative times a positive gives me a negative. A negative times a negative gives me a positive. And so those are the rules for multiplying signed numbers. I think that's pretty simple for you all to figure out. So going back to our goal, today we will learn the rules for multiplying signed numbers. The question, what is the multiplicative inverse? If you can't remember, read this again and it will tell you. I will throw up a couple of new practice problems on the board when I see you in the morning. And that's it for today's lesson. I hope that it makes sense. I'll see you soon. Bye!